It is an absolute delight to see so many of you, so many faces that I know and missed over the last 2-3 years. I wish we can come together under better circumstances and in person. So I wrote a book. I think it is in German, and this is the first time I'm going to talk about it in English. So let's see how that goes. The book has 4 parts, and I'm definitely not going to present all of that today. Basically, it starts with an overview of the crisis of our day. Second, it asks a question, so if the neoliberal order is coming to an end, why does the left not profit from that? Or on the very contrary, why does the right profit from that? It then introduces this new way of approaching politics, this new way of approaching and organizing transformational change, which I call transformative realism. And finally, in the 4th part, sets out to construct 5 platforms, 5 examples, how this could potentially look like. So without any further ado, I will share my screen with you. And I do hope you can see that now and hear me, yes? Okay, I just assume that's the case. So basically what I'm trying to argue is that all the big crises of our time, financial crisis, sovereign debt crisis, euro crisis, social inequality, the climate crisis, refugee crisis, the crisis of democracy and the rise of right-wing populism, they are all connected, they reinforce each other, and they consolidate into something which I call a broad systemic crisis. I will just dive into that just to highlight a few of these connections, but not too much of it in the interest of time. The point that I'm trying to carry away from this is that the crisis is so interconnected that you cannot patch the different subsystems anymore, but you have to tackle it on a more fundamental level. So what we see, especially, let's say, in Western countries, the book is written for a German audience, but I think what I say applies very much for other parts of Europe as well as North America, and can be adapted in parts to India as well, is that we have in global capitalism a demand crisis going back to the 1970s, and several attempts to solve this by injecting demand into the system, be it inflation, be it private debt, be it sovereign debt, etc. But basically the idea is to create demand in the system. That has led to, fast forward to 2008, to the subprime crisis in the US financial markets and the global financial crisis, which was then tackled basically by cheap money, by printing money through the central banks, which has unleashed an explosion of wealth funds, basically wine, real estate, gold, all these things have gone through the roof, thereby opening up the gap between the very rich and the rest of the society. It also has basically put the states, especially European states, on the back foot because they had to bail out the banks, leading directly to a sovereign debt crisis, or as we call it in Europe, the euro crisis. What has been unleashed in order to get the state finances back under control is a austerity round. So basically, the cost of the crisis had to be picked up by the lower third of the population, and especially in Southern Europe, which then created several waves of populism, right-wing populism, of all those who feel left behind, of all those who feel punished, of all those who feel not recognized, leading to the crisis of democracy that we see today, and so on. So it's just an example to play around with the different subsystems in order to carry home the point that all of these crises are not singular events, they're not accidents, but they're all connected and they influence each other. And my point that I'm trying to make is you cannot tackle this with the governance model that has been prevailing in the West for the last 30 years. If we have a look into that, basically this governance system or approach that I've been mentioning. I call it technocratic incrementalism. The idea is to say, okay, there are a couple of policy challenges, there's a couple of problems, so let's fix them based on expertise, step by step, with policy. So what you need and the instruments that you're going to use is regulations, putting incentives, usually very much market-driven solutions, and you try to engineer the system to optimize it better, right? That has worked very well. It's basically in Germany personalized through Angela Merkel and her cabinet, which has been approaching problems exactly this way. Let's say rather scientific by the method. There is a lot of good governance expertise in the system. The problem is that the crises are so big right now and so interconnecting that this approach of optimizing the system no longer works. So out of frustration with this incrementalism, the little steps, step-by-step approach on the progressive end of the political field, a new approach has emerged recently, very strong in the US and the United Kingdom, but also in France and in Germany. We see it. I call that moralist activism. So basically the idea is that the state somehow does not perform, does not get the crisis under control. So they are actually calling upon the individuals to understand what needs to be done and call upon them to change their behavior. The theory of change is that if everyone changes his or her behavior, in some, the society will also change and will basically get the problems under control. So this method works very much with moral appeals, also bans of certain behaviors and language, but also in terms of visibility and representations with quota. The strength of this approach is that it actually has a very high mobilizing effect on very passionate supporters. The problem is that the sub-system or the subculture that actually supports this is rather limited. I put it at 5% of the population right here. And the activists either cannot or very oftentimes do not have the political will, refuse to mobilize beyond this already convinced life world. So the transformative realism that I propose is a different approach, one that actually recognizes that change can only be the outcome of societal struggles, and between those who want to preserve the status quo and those who want change. So you basically focus on the balance of social forces. That means you can only basically win the political struggles by building broad societal alliances in order to push through or overpower the forces of the status quo and thereby change the society. The instruments that you use are very much discourse-centered, but there's also elements of financial compensation for the so-called losers of change. But the overall idea is to create a social compromise between different classes, milieus, and life worlds in order to create a broad platform that allows the society to move on together. The problem that transformative realism or all political economist approaches have to face is that building alliances is a very, very difficult thing. Still, I would like to emphasize that no single community, no matter how strong it is financially, economically, or in terms of discourse power, alone is strong enough to shift the development path. So only broad societal alliances can mobilize the power resources needed to win the struggle against the forces of the status quo. But this alliance building is notoriously difficult because social groups, like individuals, have diverging interests, identities, and ideologies. So alliance building is the name of the game. Everyone talks about it. On the greater left, I would say, there are different approaches how to build societal alliances. The oldest one is the catch-all alliance that the popular parties in Germany are still using. So it's the 1990s Clinton machine approach of, doing heavy polling, heavy focus groups, tested policy proposal for every democratic niche, even if it's as small and irrelevant. And so you're trying to have many, many programs, many policies in order to get everyone on the bus. That's very adaptive and flexible. It was an approach that was predominant in the 90s and the 2000s. The problem is that it does not generate a lot of passion, so it's not good at mobilizing, and the societal cleavages in the society as a whole are imported into the alliance. Very popular right now on the progressive list is the intersectional alliance. Basically, the idea to woo the minorities together with the academic middle class onto a platform. Again, very passionate supporters, very high turnout of a very limited social strata. I think the glass ceiling for intersectional alliances is 25% of Western alliances. And therefore, you have two problems. First of all, you're not strong enough to become hegemonic to win the struggle. And second of all, because you emphasize the identity of the group so much, you have every identity group basically trying to optimize their share of the cake, and therefore you have lots of zero-sum games between identitarian tribes. We call that tribal politics. So I think this approach has its limits. Also very popular is the left populist alliance. So basically the idea is to refocus on the white working class. You try to mobilize the lower third of the population. And the frame that you use is the 1% elite against the 99% against them. The advantage of this left populist frame is that you can mobilize across class and milieus. The problem with it, on the other hand, is that it does not understand culture and identity very well, and it hasn't been working outside a few countries of Southern Europe. So the approach is, in the empirical reality, not really working. So transformative realism is actually proposing a different sort of alliance. It is trying to invite all those who want a better alternative to the status quo, but not the spoilers. So you try to mobilize 50 plus X% of the society. And that means that you need to be able to build bridges between communities with diverging interests and identities. That's the key of the method. The idea is to organize a struggle over hegemony, not a class struggle. So the platforms of transformative change making, of transformative alliances, are deliberately very broad, allowing groups of different interests, identities, and ideology to join forces upon them. That means transformative realism rejects radical agendas because the narrow coalition that will come out of this cannot mobilize the power resources needed to push through the shift in the development path that we need. And by the way, is triggering reactionary counter revolts on the opposite side of the spectrum. Think about right-wing populism, think about those who deny the existence of climate change, think about those who deny the severity or even the existence of the corona pandemic and so on. So basically the strongly radical agendas of the progressive camp trigger a counter revolt on the other side, basically in terms of the balance of power in the entire society, balancing each other out. So what I propose is to be as broad as possible and try to include everyone who can see themselves in an alternative paradigm. So how does that look like? If we have a deeper look into Germany as a post-industrial society, post-industrial societies tend to be fragmented, more than the old industrial societies looked like. We have a study here that's from 2018 that actually identifies 9 life worlds, which is a little bit of a different word for milieu, who have different sizes. You see that, for instance, the academic progressive elite is 9% of the German population, whereas the civically engaged citizenry is 18%, and so on. There's a couple of things that we have understood over the last couple of years, and one important point is that life worlds are no longer vote banks for political parties. So the old idea that a milieu tends to have its own political party, or that a political party can actually mobilize its own milieu, is over. You see that if you look at the results of the German election of 2017, would look a bit different today, but the point is the same. You see that all the life worlds have different political affiliations. Those colors are basically the colors of German political parties. So that is a little bit of a frustrating news, because the way that we discuss strategy in the progressive camp is that usually, some people would like to mobilize the workers, some others would like to concentrate on the middle class, some people would like to talk to cosmopolitans, some other to communitarians. You know, however, is that life worlds do share distinct worldviews, values, hopes, and fears. And because we know how to actually map this in the ideological field, it will be possible to target them with carefully crafted narratives. So the platforms that I'm going to talk about right now are always this. They are a set of policies, they are a narrative, and they target certain life worlds and try to bring them together on the same platform to build an alliance. That's what I mean with platforms. And I'm just going to introduce 2 right now to show you how it works. So this one is not for me, obviously. The Green New Deal has been around for a couple of years, and it shows you how it is possible to build transformative alliances. If you listen to the radical climate change activists, here in Germany, we have Extinction Rebellion, but also Fridays for Future. They call for a climate revolution. So their idea is to say the problem ahead of us is so overwhelming that only a massive disruption in the way that we live our lives and produce and travel, but also a radical break with the status quo policymaking can actually deliver the results that we need in time, right? What you see, however, is that the climate revolution only mobilizes the progressive academic life world and parts of the civically engaged elites. So only a fraction of the society is actually willing to come together on that platform. There is a technocratic incrementalist idea as well. It's called the Green Deal that the European Commission is proposing right now together with federations of the industry and so on. So they bring together climate activists with the industry, especially with tech, the tech sector, and try to basically deliver proposals and solutions for climate change through technological change. This platform is already much broader than the climate revolution, but still it only mobilizes a fraction of the German society. So if you want to avoid what we have seen, for instance, with the yellow vests in France, basically this counter rebellions on the other side, the people who say, we don't want this, we don't believe in this, and we are basically going to be the losers of the structural change that you propose. You need a much broader platform, and the Green New Deal is such a platform. It actually brings together the majority of life worlds in Germany onto one platform. There is another takeaway from this, and I think it's very important to understand, because policymakers and the experts that actually consult policymakers tend to come from the same life world, the progressive academic life world. I come from that life world. Many of you also come from a similar life world in India. So the problem is, if you basically propose solutions that make sense in your world, you may alienate other groups in society, therefore creating narrow platforms, narrow alliances that actually trigger counter revolts, and therefore stalling the very progress that you want to see. So my approach, transformative realism, would say the progressive academic life work is obviously and of course invited, but it's not constitutive of the transformative alliance. Let's give you one last one. This is a genuine one that I have developed, especially, as you can see, only for the German context. It cannot be basically put into another context like India, because all the platforms are developed from the logic of the German political field for the German political field. So basically, these bubbles that you see, the life words, are constitutive, and they cannot be replaced with something else. The Gardner state is basically the idea that post-pandemic, we will need to recalibrate the relationship between the state, the market, and civil society. We will need a break from the neoliberal market state that has basically cut back social services and cut back the capabilities of the state to a point that it was almost not possible and capable to react to the pandemic as a litmus test for governance capability. And there is a broad consensus emerging across life worlds in Germany that we need a different kind of state, a state that is capable of action, that is actually acting as an investor when it comes to social and economic transformation, especially climate change, but is also a provider of public services. So that's what I call the Gardner state. Is a broad platform that mobilizes many life worlds, but not all life worlds. So not everyone is invited onto this alliance. The spoilers are not. So that goes obviously for the neoliberals who are already calling for the next round of austerity and that are actually terrified that all these corona spending and these stimulus packages is kind of a planned economy in the making. This does not apply for the right-wing populists who want to shut the borders to the outside and want a hard security state. It does not apply for the hard left that is actually only thinking about distribution, not so much about the provision of public services. And it does not invite the neo-Maoist avant-garde or splinter groups that actually want to abandon the nation state, want to abandon the state, want to abandon borders, defund the police, and so on. So the idea is to build a broad societal platform that many life worlds can join. Enough power resources can be mobilized in order to break the status quo, but not everyone is invited, especially not those who are not willing to come together on this platform. I think I stop here because I think that was already a lot, and I'm very much looking forward to the debate.